into the conversation now. Janet Love, the Deputy Chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission. A very good morning to you. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. Tell us what you know. Tell us perhaps your first encounters with Pravin Gordhan.
So PG was a person who worked in both overt democratic movement mobilization and also the underground, and as somebody who was part of the structures but working based outside the country for some years. I had heard about PG, but more in his public role, but had a sense that he was involved in the underground. But it was only when I came back to South Africa as part of Operation Vuyo that I worked directly with him. And thereafter, in the negotiation process, in the Transitional Executive Council, and then we went to Parliament together in that first Parliament, which also involved constitution writing. We were both portfolio committee chairpersons, so we kind of had to deal with those parliamentary processes. And then, after that, he went on to executive and a range of other things. But we've kept in contact.
That was a lot in a few seconds. But back from the time, what had you heard about him before you even met him?
Well, today a lot of people use the term door-to-door mobilization. I think that if you ever want to understand what that can mean in practice in terms of building a movement, the work that he did is really what, for so many people, was both, their schooling, but also became legendary. His focus on detail, his understanding that you don't go to an area to tell people anything. You go to an area to understand what people's problems are. You go to an area to listen, and you come back with things that can empower people to actually have the agency themselves. And I think those are the kinds of things that I heard about him, which made me recognize why people saw him as a leader and had the kind of respect that they did for him.
And then you finally got to meet with him and then work with him as part of Operation Vuyo.
I did. We were in, his structures were very much based in what was then Natal. I was working more closely with the overall communications, including those of Natal. So in terms of the detail of Operation Vuyo, we intersected at that level. But again, I think that his when the one cell was at the Knoll was broken, and people from Operation Vuyo were arrested, and a number of us were in other parts of the country. It was then that you could again see the strength of somebody who was going into detention for the third time, who had suffered really, really hellish torture, and yet from what we could see, from what was and wasn't exposed, being still able to be on the run. The fact of his strength was one of the things that gave us strength, even though he'd had to face that before.
So even though the system tried to break him, he just couldn't be broken.
I think that determination, that strength, and really that ability to be incredibly firm in himself about what he thought was right, and to be willing to die for it if he had to.
Do you think that's what carried him in latter years? I'm talking now about exposing state capture, being part of a group, a whole lot of people who exposed state capture. When he was, as the provincial secretary of the ANC was saying earlier, when he was vilified, do you think that strength is what carried him in these years, right up to when he decided to quit active, or at least parliamentary politics ahead of the May 29 elections?
I think it was a critical part of what made that possible for him to withstand. But I do think that one of the other, or two of the other things, are the fact that You know, when he was doing things that he was doing, when he was exposing corruption that he was exposing, he wasn't doing it as if he was alone. He was taking people with him. If you look at the outpouring of support that came from various communities that he had worked in, that people knew how he had been vigilant at every turn, it was them who he turned to say, this is why and this is what I think and this is what I believe in. So that was a real source of strength. And then his family. I mean, his wife, his 2 daughters are 3 hugely strong women, as well as his extended family. But I mean, that's, you know, their contribution to enabling somebody like that to live with the pressures, I think, is something one can't discount.
You touched earlier on an important part of our history that I think is often overlooked, because from where I sit, as someone who has been, covering the political space since 1994, I remember right at the beginning, Frini's Jinwala as the Speaker of the National Assembly. I think Bulelani Ngcuka, was the Deputy Chair of the NCOP. And I remember at the time there was a tendency starting to emerge where members of the executive, who were almost all of them more sort of senior within the ANC, started undermining Parliament and the oversight role that it had to play. They started not attending portfolio or select committee meetings. And Steve Tshwete at the time was the leader of government business. And there was a big thing about it that had to be resolved there and then. And the reason I'm asking this, because in his latter years, you would have known that or read about this, there were clashes between the portfolio committee and members of the executive, of which he was one, public enterprises in particular. As a former, or as a person who was a chairperson of a portfolio committee back in the day, with all the ideals that drove, especially everyone who came from the broad mass liberation movement, and looking at what is happening now, just your thoughts as an observer, of course, because you're no longer in that space.
Well, I'm in that space in a different way,
Yes.
in that we have to account to Parliament. And I do think that Parliament has gone through various phases. I think that the first Parliament, the first 5 years, it was a strong Parliament for a number of reasons. Firstly, there were enough senior people who were both within the executive as well as within the legislature. And so within the parliamentary committees in those first 5 years, there was a drive and almost an impatience that really made a lot of things happen and drew in the people who were in the executive in a way that there was both accountability, but also, I mean, when I think about the committee that I had the possibility to chair, the Water and Agriculture Committee, and I think about people like Kader Asmal. I mean, Kader Asmal was engaged with the committee right through, where we repealed 68 pieces of legislation. I mean, and Pravin's committee was dealing with local government, which, as you know, had not consolidated decisions up until the end of that first parliament, and it was because they were engaging so robustly. So I think that robustness was something that could happen then. You're right, there were things that happened afterwards, and I think that Parliament has evolved in many ways, including getting experience of things like the litigious nature of our society. So today, our portfolio committees, I think, have to be very mindful in a way that maybe we weren't, and maybe that was not necessarily a good thing, but about things like the litigious nature of, have they done, the necessary consultation, and so on and so forth. And so many things go through paces that we did not have to deal with. Secondly, I think that there are things that have settled in ways that one committee is going to have to deal with a lot of intergovernmental relations. And I'm not sure that our portfolio committees or even our structures are necessarily geared to that. So when I reflect on, what has happened, I think that what we're seeing now is an engagement that is certainly not as at the time that you're talking about when things seem to be going down, but I think it's one where there are going to be a lot of things that for the members of Parliament have to be clarified. I do think one thing that I would say is that in our day, there were very few members of Parliament who did not go out and do their constituency work on weekends. So commuting to your constituency was a really big thing. I hope that is something that is being taken up, at an individual level and not just in terms of committees going and doing their work in other areas. But it was something that, again, I think that when I think about somebody like Pravin, he did his constituency work. Yeah.
Janet Love, let me thank you for your time.
Thank you very
Really
much.
appreciate it. Janet Love, of course, the Deputy Chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission, someone